Welcome everybody to Business Monday. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO of GoLocal. It's the 4 o'clock hour. You know what that means. It means cha-ching. Gary Sasse, the money man, is in the house. Beautiful day, Monday in downtown Providence. A little windy, I got some intelligence on. But things are hopping in England, Washington, D.C., Providence, Rhode Island. Let's start here. Let's talk new business rankings out from Wallet Hub on which state economies are the best performing. Massachusetts, number 3 in the United States. Rhode Island, number 43 in the United States.
You know,
Is it the power of the Attleboroughs? Does it everything stop at the Attleboroughs?
I think it's the power of Charlie Baker and other things, and MIT and Harvard and a few things like that, and also a great hospital, Partners Hospital up there. I go through the list. No, it's very, very, very perplexing. You know, the Wallet Hub report, which is a credible report because it broke things down by economic activity, innovation, and economic health, and used the garden variety measures. There wasn't any funny assumptions in there. And so we're 43rd, Massachusetts is 3rd, but that's only part of the story. We're the worst in New England. And even Connecticut, everybody picks on Connecticut.
And Maine, half the state is like...
well, Maine was pretty close to us.
Yeah, rural wasteland, and still beat us.
But Connecticut wasn't close to us.
No.
Connecticut was 27th. They were in the middle somewhere. And when you break down the numbers on economic activity, which shows where the momentum is, we were dead last. We were 50th. The only good news I can find in the poll or their survey was when they looked at innovation. We were in the middle somewhere, which says there's some potential to innovate. Yet our policies were not directed at innovation; they were directed at real estate. We can talk about that. But when I saw those numbers, I said, well, let me go back and look at what I would consider the leading economic indicators, and not over the last year, but over the last 5 years to see how we were doing. And just to bounce them off quickly, because the results are all the same, on population, on the percentage of population that's in the workforce, on labor force participation, on payroll employment, on the growth in employment, on the growth in wages, on the growth in state domestic product, gross state product, on the productivity of worker, we trail, and I didn't have a lot of times, but looked at the United States as a whole and Massachusetts. On every key economic indicator, we trail. And I look at this not in a sense of 1 year or 2 years, but I looked over a 5 or 7 year time horizon. And that's very, very perplexing.
I thought what was most disturbing on the Wallet Hub data was that Rhode Island ranks 50th on GDP growth. And that seems almost impossible that we're trailing Mississippi. Whenever you're trailing Mississippi, you're really in trouble. When you're trailing West Virginia, you're really, really in trouble.
Well, let me put the numbers in perspective for you, because this is the kinds of things I looked at, and the time frame is not as narrow as the Wallet Hub time frame. My time frame is broader. For over a 5 year period, our GDP, Rhode Island's, has grown by 3.4%, Massachusetts by 13.7%, but the figure you were alluding to for the nation, I didn't break it down by region or by state, was over 10%.
Yeah.
So the gross domestic product, the economy of the nation as a whole, has grown 3 times faster than it has in Rhode Island. Massachusetts, the multiple's 4 and 5 times, and we're right next door. And so it's not just one factor. The only factor that we weren't at the bottom was the reduction in the unemployment rate, where we had a 55% reduction, and the national reduction was in the high 40s. I don't recall the exact number. Outside of that indicator, every indicator any economist would look at in Economics 101 is we are behind our neighbors and we are behind the national average. And I don't know, I can't explain it. I really can't explain it. I have some political theories and some political economic theories, but I don't have an explanation. It is mind-boggling that this information would come out so. And when you look at other things like our tax situation, we don't have a tax problem. We have a property tax problem, which keeps a lot of things out of the state. But our income tax, our sales tax, our business corporation tax are very competitive. They're moderate. They're not low, but they're moderate. So it's not the tax issue. It's not the knee-jerk reaction you hear from the right. Oh, we got to cut taxes, this place will grow. That's not true anymore. It's true about property taxes in some communities, but it's not true as a factor. And I don't know what the answer is. I think there's a whole lot of cultural and political issues that tie together.
One of the issues that seems especially concerning when you look at it in the contrast of this structure is that so much of the activity that is going on in the Rhode Island economy does seem to be tied to the construction industry.
Well, let me tell you, because I feel like, John the Baptist, because I've been saying this for 5 years, I think we missed an opportunity. And let me clarify. I think Commerce, Rhode Island is run by very capable people. I think those people work very hard. I think they've had some successes. I think some of the programs are not at scale, but they're good programs. So I'm not criticizing the people or what they're trying to do. But whoever thought of the idea in 2013 or 14 of restructuring economic development effort to create a Commerce Rhode Island, you probably had the dumbest idea. That was a 20th century reorganization solution to 21st century problems. And so I feel, having with more than the caveat, with the imprimatur of saying it's not the fault of the people that work there, it's not the fault of their programs, it is just the structure is so out of touch with the reality. And the reality is what? The reality is this: states compete to offer the most productive environment and make the most productive use of their natural resources, their people. There's nothing that we are doing as a focus in our Commerce Rhode Island to improve productivity. States create to grow innovation. We talked about I-195 as an innovation district. I don't hear that mentioned as an innovation district anymore. Maybe you do. I don't hear that mentioned at all. I hear it as a real estate district. So our buddies are making deals that way. And so and I know that if you can innovate and grow jobs, there have to be multiplier effects. And this was talked about at the Harvard Business School 20 years ago. You got to create clusters, and you create synergies in those jobs. We've had some successes. We had some good one-offs in creating and recruiting some companies and building, but they're not clusters. There's not a multiplier in effect, with them. They can prosper, they cannot prosper depending on a lot of different circumstances. So we create a Commerce Rhode Island, the approach, not the organization, not the people. I want to be very clear about that. That is really dumb in terms of what you do in a 21st century economy. We spent hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 5-6 years, and I think the legislature is going to compound the mistakes of session. I anticipate that there'll be more 1990-style economic development money, put into this year's budget. When we ought to be dealing with productivity, innovation, having that type of cost change. And I think it's unfortunate that the political leadership doesn't recognize they tried this approach. They've had some successes with it. We've had some construction. We've got the trades, working. We've had a couple of good companies come into the state. We've retained some people through the Wave Makers program. Those things have been positive. But as a whole, there's not been the scale. And to sit back and ask the question, well, what the hell was our strategy? That's a kind of very basic question. And one of the things that I think is a fair criticism, and it's the lack of transparency. So a lot of good government guys talk about lack of transparency. Well, it doesn't mean too much, just say it. What transparency means in economic development, there were never any published goals. How many jobs do we want to create in innovation? How many construction jobs do we want to create? How many hotels do we need to subsidize? And so we never had any standard on which to measure what we were doing against. And that's the lack of transparency that's hurt us.
So one of the things that got revisited at the end of last week was the Superman building. The National Historic Trust named it one of the 11 most endangered buildings in America. Our columnist, architectural critic, Will Morgan, who used to be with the Boston Globe, wrote a piece on why it's historically valuable and critical to the state's future. Your thoughts on that building?
Well, it's in the eye of the beholder. It's seriously a tough call. I would not call for tearing down the Chrysler Building in New York City. I would not suggest that the Empire State Building was having trouble, that you tear down that kind of iconic building. I think what was
Is that our version, though, of
well,
the
that,
iconic?
that's the question.
Yeah.
You know, we're not New York City. We're in a state of 1 million, people. It may have iconic value and historical value to us, but does it translate? Is it tradable? And that's the dilemma. So you have a bunch of people sitting around saying, "Oh, it's a historic building. It's a unique building." Okay, what is the traded value? Because that is the critical issue in economic development and a redevelopment issue. And that's why I have a difference. And I respect the people that put it on a register, say it's an iconic building. It's been around, well, since 1927 now. It's almost 100, it'd be 100 years old, soon.
Yep.
But what's the economic value of it, and what's the balance between feeling good about saving an historic building, which it is, and rebuilding this financial district? And no one seems to be able to answer that question. And as a person who believes that these decisions are largely market-driven, I don't see the market driving that. And I think at some point you got to put the clock on. It's like playing a basketball game. You got 60 minutes of a football game.
Well, I think nature is going to put the clock on it to some degree. I'll throw out, though, a little curveball. Certainly the vacant Masonic Temple building was vacant from the 1929 until 10 or 15 years ago when it was redeveloped into the Renaissance. I don't know that many people thought it would ever get redeveloped. That there were lots of different analyses to look at what its future and best use were. It was also looked at as long ago as 1965 by then Governor John Chafee to tear it down.
Yeah, in fact, I was involved with that, not involved in the plan that Governor Almond came up with, but at one of the jobs I had, I stopped, was instrumental in stopping from tearing down. We didn't have a better use for it,
Yeah.
but so let's be careful.
Right.
And then I think it was just a happening of time. Governor Almond, pushed for it. Federal monies became available. There was a market use for it. And so there are two important ingredients for the Superman building. Is there a market use for it?
Right.
And don't tell me the market use is to chop it up into little apartments. That's not.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's a very good use for it. The problem downtown, we've been here for our entire history, 9 years. It is vacant most of the time. It is struggles to create any energy as a downtown financial core. Seen a lot of businesses move out. Restaurants and bars that open have a hard time staying in business. We've seen multiples trade in and out. It needs a significant infusion of a workforce into the financial district.
Right, and you can't create it artificially. So in the case of the Masonic Temple, the timing was good.
Right.
There was federal money. There was
Historic and state tax credits.
Historic state tax credits could be used, but there also was an economic
Federal and state tax
federal,
credit.
but there was also an economic value
Right.
that somebody saw, so they came and took advantage of the federal and state, largesse, and converted it into a hotel. At that time, there weren't many hotels,
Right.
rooms in the city. And so what you have to look at with the Superman building is, okay, what does the market think it can be used for? And what does the market think it can be a reasonable cost, economic cost in redeveloping, that? And then I think the most important question is in terms of how we redevelop Providence. How does it fit into the overall strategic and the plan and the tactics that we want to use? So having a one-off, investing a lot of money in one building without a clear market use, without assurance of how that market use has synergies that feed the other properties around here is really problematic. There's going to have to be public money and public subsidies used for that type of project, and that's all the more reason why there has to be a public strategy of how those monies will be reinvested. And the synergies, the same thing we spoke about before on Commerce, Rhode Island, being successful in finding a company here and a company there, but not a cluster. And so I think that those are the kinds of tough economic issues and not the feel-good issues of putting on some kind of register.
Let's go over to 195 for a second. You make the point that it's really become a a development project much more than an innovation center. We're yet to see it become the home to a new technology or biomedical firm of any significance. Most of the land remains vacant, and we're 20 years into this project with the moving of the highways as well as the redevelopment of it. I think the redevelopment for most of that land was cleared in the 2011, 2012. Most of that land came on the market. Is it time to reboot and refocus it rather than key pieces just being chipped off for retail and hospitality and apartments?
I don't know. The business community seems to have disappeared. They were big promoters of I-95. As a matter of fact, they coined the phrase, it was our innovation district. And the only innovation effort I see there, which is arguable, is Wexford,
Right.
and having some innovation kinds of activities. But again, how does it tie to something?
Right.
You gotta create clusters. There's no cluster being created in the center, so it may be another example of not maximizing what kind of opportunities that we have, that kind of urban real estate. I also think, and I would be way off base on this, but I have a very traditional view of what are responsibilities of municipalities, state, and how you get cooperation. And thinking you can come and superimpose a higher level of government in the middle of a city is a very difficult thing to effectively implement. Robert Moses with the New York Port Authority, his time expired when he built the last expressway through the Bronx or something. And so it's a very difficult model to follow. And the governance structure you use is important. And as a result, you really have to, at the end of the day, say, okay, it hasn't developed as quickly as we would have liked. Why? And I think the governance structure and the politics were a contributing factor.
So is there something broken about it? Let me raise some issues. Citizens Bank could have built in the 195 land. They went out to Johnston. Amgen's wildly expanded, and I know that they have a campus down in West Greenwich, but they certainly, if they thought there was brain trust and other values, they could have come into the city. Let's talk Hasbro's been in flux for a year and a half as to what they plan on doing. They could go in the 195. I mean, here's three major corporations that have had an opportunity to go to the 195 land and have said,
well, I don't know
at least to date, I'm not really interested.
I don't know what drove the corporate decisions. I don't think it was the 195 land. I think it was, issues that were internal.
But raw, just think about it for a second, flip it around. Raw land in the middle of a city, next to an Ivy League institution, next to 5 more colleges and universities, and they pick West Greenwich. Amgen says, we're good down in Johnston. Amgen says, we're happy in West Greenwich. Hasbro's yet to make a decision.
But that's not new. Look at what Fidelity's decisions were back.
Yep, right next to Bryant University.
Well, that was a good location.
Right. But it was strategic. They wanted to recruit Bryant grads.
And I imagine if you looked at Citizens Bank, they had very good reasons for needing the kind of campus that they needed. Amica was downtown Rhode Island for decades.
Yep.
It was a iconic company in downtown Rhode Island. Their business model required them to have a campus. And so, business is going to locate where it's in the best interest of business. What government's responsibility is to try to identify those businesses.
Are we not attractive enough? Is there something in the DNA of the presentation that we're making to companies, gosh, we've rebuilt the waterways, we're putting in pedestrian bridges, we're building everything under God's green earth to make it attractive, to make it easy, to make it...
No, I think it's more basic than that. I think we've done a lot, particularly in the city of Providence, in relocating, moving the waters. Providence is well written. It's a beautiful community. We've done a good job in the physical development. But what we haven't done a good job is dealing with, understanding what kind of public policies the government can deal with and what they couldn't deal with. So we have a god-awful property tax burden here. So no one would come to build anything in Providence.
Commercial property tax, 5th highest in the country.
Of the top 50 cities, right?
Yeah.
And so, that's a problem. No one wants to build a company and have the people they apply, particularly if they're upper level management or middle level management people, go to schools here.
Yeah.
And so we haven't fixed our school system. We haven't dealt with our property tax issue. There are the way we approached economic development, and I can get kind of academic and abstract. I'm trying not to, but when we were in the depths of the Great Recession, our answer was to create Commerce Rhode Island, which was to give out hundreds of millions of dollars of grants. Some of them worked, some of them didn't work, but it wasn't a strategy. It was
Right.
It was one part of an activity.
But you talk about clusters. If you said to me, there's 195 has a strategy for attracting certain businesses in certain clusters, I would not know that. I don't think if you go to their website, you would understand other than maybe, there's
Well,
some tie-in.
Let me the original conversation was, and these were conversations,
Sure.
not work. But it was always envisioned that the kind of cluster that you could create, an innovation cluster, had two anchors. It had one anchor was hospitals,
Right.
And we have some really strong research facility hospitals. It had Brown University, education institutions. Also had Johnson and Wales, which built some there. One example of something that we did do that was consistent, with I-95, it's happened before I-95, was the Joint Nursing School.
Right.
That's the kind of,
Been a win.
makes sense. Well, it's like playing a baseball game and you score 2 runs in the first inning and you think the game's over. No, there are 8 more innings to go. And we haven't kept the first team in for those next 7 innings.
But in our competing, whatever we think is our competing peer class of cities, if they opened up, and we're far behind Boston in lots of ways, but if you opened up 5 acres in Boston, Massachusetts, you'd have a knife fight of corporate CEOs trying to get a hold of that land.
But you got to, and that's in some ways an unfair comparison, because you also have to compare what's happening here at Hartford and Springfield and New Haven, Manchester, Portland, Maine.
Portland, Maine, it would be gobbled up in a nanosecond.
But my point is, let's have fair, comparisons. So it's easy to
Argue for your limitations, they are yours. If you want your competitive set to be Springfield, you're in a lot of trouble.
No, but you have to be realistic of what you're competing for and where you're a back office operation and where you're not. And so when we hold up Boston and say we're not competing with Boston, well, very few cities in the world are competing with Boston.
But we're supposed to be that small, cool city, right? Springfield's not on the list of small, cool cities. We're in GQ and the Washington Post and CNN. We have great restaurants and a great art community and these things. But
I believe in Jerry Maguire. Show me the. I've read a lot of Richard Florida's work.
Yes.
Going back, and we're going to attract the young urban people, and then there's the element there. But if you think, and Toronto's done that very well. That's why Florida's in Toronto right now.
Right.
But if you think that this is the mass question, this is the scale question. There's a place for it, no question. And it's great to be cool, and it's great to have amenities that attract young professionals here. Great. You need other things that we don't invest in to help them get here, like decent housing, good schools for their kids, things that really would drive the train to bring it to scale. And so while I don't discount that, while I think it's important, while we need to be cool, while it helps a certain part of the culture and the economy, you don't rebuild a city just with that. And it's a kind of a romantic, posture that when Jerry said, follow the money, follow the money. You asked me questions, earlier.
Let's show me the money.
Show me the money. Okay, I follow it. But you asked me questions, why certain large corporations made the decisions they did. Well, the reason they made the decision was what they felt was best for their company. But we did not put ourselves in a position to compete successfully at the end of the day. And it was more than just making a place cool and show up for, a segment. We needed to do that. There was conversation when Fidelity, came here about relocating Fidelity into the city of Providence.
Yep.
And given the nature and the kind of business they had and what they were doing in that facility, it didn't make sense not to, go out to a bigger
Now,
place.
let me invert it a little bit. Imagine if Fidelity was in Providence, Amica was in Providence, Citizens Bank was in Providence, Amgen had a significant headquarters here in Providence. very, very different city.
But the world has changed. Citizens Bank was in Providence. You know, I've been on the board. I was on the
Yep.
board for a long time when we built the building
Yeah,
there.
the tower over on.
And the intent but the bank grew, very different bank than when that tower
Right.
was built. It needed different kind of space, back office as well as front office. Nature of the financial industries changed. People don't to the same degree depend upon neighborhood branch banks anymore. There's something called ATM machines,
Right.
and there's something called online banking, and a number of things. And so, as the economy changed, the needs of business changed, and the needs of business to be downtown Providence in a financial area, changed. So, the Industrial National Bank building was built in 1927. The Hospital Trust building, which has now been taken over several years ago by RISD as the dorm, it was built in 1910, I think.
Could make a nice building for the Hassenfeld Institute. Give Brian a downtown campus. In our last couple of minutes, State House action is winding down. It looks like in the next 2 to 3 weeks. They're trying to get out before July 4th.
I'm sure it will.
There's always a twist and turn. The last 2 years, I think, have ended in hissy fits of some kind between legislative leaders. It seems like there's a reality as to what the state's financial situation is, and legislative leaders are working against that as a sort of baseline for their budgeting, and it does not seem to be a tremendous amount of energy about most anything else other than maybe reproductive rights issues.
Well, I think there'll be some good education reform bills passed, not as extensive as they advertised, but I think there'll be some legislation to encourage.
I think sitting in this chair a few months ago was a very insightful comments by a very smart guy who said, unless they're going to do the teachers and unless they're going to do high stakes testing, does it really matter?
Well, at the end of the day.
And those two things are not on the table right now.
But at the end of the day, I think that's true. And also, the other thing that smart guy said is you got to invest in it. It's not,
Right.
It's not for free. But you also have to, lay the foundation better than we've laid the foundation. And so I think there'll be one thing in particular will be very helpful in building this foundation, and that's the curriculum frameworks to tie curriculum with standards, with teaching, with testing, which we don't have. So that's good. That's positive, and it builds a foundation so you can do.
So I'm going to push back a little. I'm going to give you the same comment I gave to Neil Steinberg a couple months ago. He said, well, you can't fix these things overnight. And I said, I heard that comment the first time in 1991 when I was on the Providence City Council, and our test scores were horrific, and the quality of the urban corridors, school systems were god-awful.
I chaired the 21st Century Education Commission in 1991 for Bruce Sunland.
Right.
And if they had stayed with that report, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. The things that are being proposed are helpful. They're not the game changes but they're helpful. And so there's really no.
So how do you get there, though? Let's say we pass these easier, that there's a consensus about. They're not the tough issues. They're not on funding. They're not on high-stakes testing. They're not on teacher evaluation.
There's some stuff
next year is an election year. We're not going to pass it next year.
Well, I feel this way, that we have to get to amend our Constitution to make education an enforceable right. Until we do that, it's hard. But that's not to say that this session, putting everything into context, putting the fiscal problems into context, putting the lack of willingness to provide adequate funding for schools. Let me mention one figure to you, which doesn't get a lot of attention. Rhode Island is 39th in the portion of state funding supporting education. That's not to say we don't spend a lot per pupil, but the portion is 39th. We're 12th in what comes from local governments. Mm-hmm. So until we deal with that, until we move closer to the middle, it's with the property tax burden, it's hard. But that's not to say you don't make your curriculum in line with the other things. It doesn't say you don't look at ways to give principals more authority. And there are some stuff in there about teachers, about teacher evaluation, and about certification of new teachers. So it's giving everything else that's happened. The only point I'm trying to make is that I think there'll be some movement, towards education reform. but don't let anybody tell you it's a penultimate, that it's going to be a game changer. But they're positive things. I think that's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen with the budget. So when you don't have money, I had worked for a boss that it's really easy to be creative when you have a lot of money. When you don't have money, it's very hard to be creative.
Last question. President Donald Trump seems to be in love with trade wars. And the stock market doesn't seem to punish him, despite ongoing with China, ever escalating, and now him using threats against Mexico to try and control immigration by leveraging trade penalties against Mexico.
Well, you're asking the wrong guy, because I think Donald Trump's an embarrassment as a leader. I think there are a lot of things that affect the stock market. Certainly, national policy, is one, and tariffs and trade are, very important. But there's a steady hand of the Federal Reserve on monetary, policy, which is helpful. And there's the demand with it in the economy that government can try to screw up, but they can't completely screw up. So I think it's compounded. I think we would be doing a lot better if we had a more predictable trade policy, a more predictable foreign policy. Keep this in mind. We have the lowest unemployment we've had in 50 years.
Right.
And yet there's a little bit of angst,
A lot of angst.
and the president hasn't been an effective leader, because one of the jobs of a president, regardless of the ideology, is to bring people, together. And when you talk about 3.6% unemployment, we should be a lot closer together than we are.
With that, Gary Sasse has the last word. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in on Business Money. We'll be back tomorrow. Kate Nagel's got the afternoon shift. I believe she's got all-star political scientist Jennifer Lawless from the University of Virginia, and a host of other guests. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in today. And more coming up this evening on GoLocal. A couple of emerging stories take a look at. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you back tomorrow on GoLocal Live.